The other day, my son asked me if I had ever encountered something scary, like a ghost or a monster. I took a moment to think about the answer, but that moment was fleeting. I had, in fact, encountered something truly terrifying when I was younger, and I've decided to write it down while the memory is still fresh in my mind. I grew up in southern Michigan in the late 80s, early 90s. During that time, we didn't have all the fancy bits of technology that we do nowadays. Wow, just writing that sentence made me feel like I'm 1,000 years old. However, it was a true statement. We weren't as connected back then as we are now. And to circumvent that, we all had to go outside and enjoy each other's company. My friends and I would hang out all over town. On the weekends, we'd all emerge from our households and begin biking all over the neighborhood. Usually, we'd just pick one of our respective houses to relax at, but our parents would often tell us to go hang out somewhere else. Over time, we'd journey from place to place. We spent a lot of time hanging out in front of the local 7-Eleven, but unless we had money, they often told us to hit the bricks. There was a church nearby that for some reason always seemed perpetually closed. Even on Sundays, we would never see anybody there. We would hang on the back stairs of the building near the parking lot. Eventually, police would show up and tell us all that we were trespassing and to find another place. Overall, there weren't many locations in which we could just hang out together. But there was one spot in town which was very popular with families. It was Braxton Park. Braxton Park was a large park that held all sorts of events, from fairs to town barbecues to school festivals. It was a large chunk of land that seemed to stretch endlessly. At the southern end of the park, there were 3 basketball courts and a tennis court, all lined with fences. On the northern end was the main playground area. It had been recently installed and all the equipment there was brand new. Brightly colored slides and swings dotted the edges, while the main play area filled the center. In between the courts and the playground were nothing but scattered trees, too sparse to be considered a forest, and too dense to drive a car through it. Well, that is if you weren't careful. Off on the eastern edge of the park was the remnants of the previous play area. Tall metal slides that seemed to stretch high into the sky. They were much bigger than the new ones, which were made out of plastic, probably installed for safety reasons. Thinking back, I remember how the metal slides would sear your legs and back if you used it in the summer. If you were unfortunate to fall off the slide near the top, well, you were in for quite a drop. Right next to those metal slides were a few rusted sets of swings which seemed like they would break apart at any moment. On the western side of the park was a recreational facility, which housed a hockey rink as well as a main basketball court. My friends and I never went inside that place though, because it was usually rented out by amateur sports teams for days and weeks at a time. During most days, especially on the weekend, the park would be packed with people. The basketball courts would always be full of people shooting hoops. The main park area would be crowded with the frantic shrieks of children running around. Distant sounds of score buzzers could be heard emanating from the rec center. However, not many people like to hang out at the remnants of the old park on the eastern side. Honestly, there wasn't much there to begin with. Just the slides and swings I had mentioned previously, and a few picnic tables. My friends and I would park our bikes at the tables and we'd spend our day there just having fun. Occasionally, a family would wander over with their child from the other end of the park. We'd all sit and watch as the kids would scream when the slides would burn their legs and arms. The parents would glare at us as we all laughed amongst ourselves. After all, it was a lesson every one of us had to learn firsthand. They'd march off and we'd go back to chatting amongst ourselves. At around 6 p.m., the crowds would start to disperse, and the sun would lazily begin to set. By 8 o'clock, the entire park would be empty. We usually never hung around past 6 or 7 p.m. because our families would be expecting us home for dinner. However, during summer, that was a different story. It was the summer of '95. One Saturday morning, we had all met up with one another. We rode our bikes over to the park and arrived at our usual spot. Matt, who happened to be a year older than us, brought along his boombox. We sat there at the picnic table listening to music and eating the various snacks we had brought along with us. The hours steadily ticked by, and before we knew it, the sun was already beginning to set. After another hour, the entirety of the park was dark, aside from the basketball courts, which had some streetlights nearby illuminating the area. I asked my friends if they had to head home for dinner, but they all remarked that their parents didn't really cook during the weekdays due to working so much. I nodded in agreement, as my parents were the same way. They usually just left some cash for pizza and told us to fend for ourselves. We continued talking with one another until Matt piped up and told us to be quiet for a minute. We all looked at him wondering what he was about to say. He said that he thought he saw someone moving near the trees in the distance. Of course, we mocked him for this, but he just told us to shut up once again. We all quieted down despite a few laughs here and there. After a minute or two, we all went back to chatting. Then, another hour passed. I mentioned that it was probably time to head back home. Everyone else seemed to agree with me. We all stood up from the table and walked over to our bikes. As we moved, I noticed that one of us had stopped walking. It was Jeff. He was standing as stiff as a board. I asked him if he was alright, and this prompted the others to stop and turn as well. He just lifted a shaky finger and pointed off to the distance. I turned and saw it. There was a child no more than 7 or 8 years old, standing in between the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us. I turned and saw the color drain from Matt's face when he saw the boy. Then, one by one, more of these kids began to show up from behind the darkened trees. A minute or two passed by, and there were now at least 20 silhouettes standing all around us. I told my friends we should probably just get going, and they all nodded to me. Matt walked over to his bike first, and in the blink of an eye, one of the kids was now standing directly in front of him. A moment later, Matt was on the ground convulsing violently. I sprinted over to his side, ready to push the kid away from him. When I arrived, I could see the boy clearly. His skin was like paper, and his expression was vacant. But that's not what rooted me in place. The boy didn't have any eyes, like they had been ripped out from his skull. I quickly looked around and saw that all the other children were now much closer than before. In that brief moment of distraction, I felt something touch me, and I looked back at the boy in front of me. His hand was resting on my chest. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain shoot throughout my body. It felt like a million needles were puncturing my skin. Then the pain coalesced at my heart, and I fell to the ground clutching my shirt. It felt like someone had reached into my body, grabbed a hold of my heart, and squeezed it as hard as they could. I could feel my vision fading in and out. I had no idea what just happened to me, but there was nothing I could do other than lie there in pain next to Matt. I could hear the dissonant screams of my remaining 2 friends as they shouted incoherent words to one another. After a minute or two, I could feel my body being dragged over dirt and grass. The pain in my chest was slowly subsiding, but I still couldn't make out what was going on. Another 10 minutes passed, and I started to come back around. Apparently, Jeff and Ryan had grabbed us and dragged us out of the park. 20 more minutes passed, and I could finally catch my breath. The pain seemed to have faded entirely. Matt finally came to and recovered as well, and we all sat there not saying a single word. Ever since that day, my friends and I have never stepped foot in that park again. Years have passed by since then, and we have all fallen out of touch with one another, but I'm positive they all remember that night as clearly as I do. I think about that night frequently. Sometimes, whenever I'm driving home late at night after work, and I pass by one of the local parks in town, for a split second, I catch a glimpse of multiple silhouettes, all of them standing there motionless, in the dark, watching me as I slowly drive away.